Hello, everyone. Hi, good morning to our guests, Charly and Alex, who are both joining from the US. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
Doing really well, Ben.
Welcome to this last panel of CFO Connect Summit 2022. My name is Benjamin Romberg. I'm your moderator today, and I'm leading communications over here at Spendesk. As a quick reminder for those that don't know, this event is hosted by CFO Connect and Spendesk together. CFO Connect, of course, is our global community of finance leaders with more than 8,000 members by now. We host events just like this one. We have a private CFO Slack group and also created content for our members. So if you haven't joined yet, you can do so by clicking on the link in the chat. And then Spendesk, of course, as most of you know by now, is the 7-in-1 spend management solution for finance teams. But enough of that. So yeah, as mentioned, the bad news is the last panel of this year's summit, followed by our closing session at 6 p.m. The good news is we kept a very juicy topic for the end, which is compensation. We're going to talk about pay trends with our guests today. And our guests that are joining us, as mentioned from yesterday, is Charly Kevers, CFO at Carta, and Alex Louisy, CEO at Upflow. Thank you both for joining me today. Very warm welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for
Would
having
you
us.
like to introduce yourself quickly, your background, your companies, and what brings you here?
Alex, I'll let you start.
Thank you so much, Charly. Thanks for having us, Ben. Very happy to be here today. I didn't know this was the last session. This is a great honor, and the pressure is kind of keeping up with us.
No pressure.
No, that's good. We just so in terms of just introducing myself. So I'm the co-founder and CEO at Upflow. We're building a software to help companies actually managing the cash collection. So we have global operations. We started in Europe, but now have operations in the US. I think it was particularly interesting to discuss this topic as we see a lot of differences between Europe and the US, especially when you start growing, which has been the case for us. We raised our Series A last year, and we grew from like 13 to 50, 70 employees now. And so we this is a topic that is super important for us. So that's it for the very high level introduction on our side. Ciao.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me as well. Really excited to talk about this. So I'm Charly, the CFO of Carta. Carta is a platform to help companies and funds manage equity. So we're mostly serving private companies, very centered in the US today, but we just made an acquisition in Europe. So certainly more active in also dealing with what it means to expand beyond our initial market. And we're ourselves working on compensation as a topic, and it's a product that we offer now. So a lot of things we see in our own data that have been very insightful over the last couple of years. Excited to talk about this.
Thank you, Charly. Yeah, excited to hear about your data. And data is a good topic. Before we jump into our discussion, just a disclaimer for our audience. Most of the data we're going to be discussing today is coming from two recent surveys that we've conducted with CFO Connect and Spendesk. One is our salary benchmark, and the other one is a report we've done together with YouGov, the future of finance work. So my colleagues, I think, can share both of them in the chat, so you have access to them in case you want to dig deeper. And then, as Charly mentioned, of course, we're happy to add any data that you might have on your side and that can give us more insights into the topic. Also, before we kick things off, just a reminder, if you have any questions for Charly and Alex, please just share them in the Q&A tab, and we'll make sure to read them out and get you an answer during the session. Great. Shall we kick things off? So I thought maybe we can start with something a bit more controversial at the pay side. And I think the most controversial thing there is still the gender pay gap. And that's something we've actually seen in our own data when we did the CFO Salary Benchmark this year. We see an average gender pay gap of 13%. So male finance professionals earn 13% more on average than female colleagues do for the same role. And then in some roles and in some countries, this gap even gets as big as 30%. So that's quite something. And I would be interested to hear from your perspective, why do you think this gap still exists and keeps persisting? And what can be done to close it? And respectively, what are you doing at Upflow and at Carta to make sure that there is no such gap?
Yeah, happy to start. One thing I note, by the way, as well is the data you had, Ben, on cash is really important. we actually see a worse gap on the equity front, which obviously that's what we do, but we believe that's actually just as important as cash, because longer term we're going to have bigger impacts on the value that different people get. And so paying attention for everybody managing a company these days, it's of course you're going to make sure from a cash perspective you're in the right spot, but I would encourage everyone to also really look at equity, because this can have over multi-year really big differences. And just to throw a few data points in there so people get what I'm talking about. If you just look at, again, very US centric, but women make up about 47% of the labor force, and as far as we can see, they only own 35% of the equity on our platform, just as a topic of something else to look at. So one, just to answer your question, but how does this happen? One thing we've been working on to try to understand what we could do as a company to avoid these types of differences is actually all the way to at the offer stage. We actually don't negotiate our offers. We have very clear bands on what we want to pay people, which we review regularly. So we feel very good about, are we competitive in the market or not? And generally, we target the 75th percentile of the market. And therefore, we go with the max offer we're willing to give the person, which, because we've observed that, at least in our history, women at times are less willing to negotiate offers versus men, who tend to be a little more aggressive at negotiating offers. And that, from the get-go, starts to create differences for similar roles. And so one approach for us has been to say, here's the offer you get, and we're not negotiating. So everybody already at that point, we feel better about the similarities. And of course, it's an ongoing effort, right? Like in every compensation cycle we run a full pay equity review to make sure that we identify any differences that may still exist. Because of course, they'll creep in over time. Every manager has managed these aspects a little differently. So it's on us at a senior level to make sure this is reviewed regularly. So we do those pay equity reviews at least once a year.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at this, Ben, as well, in terms of like looking at different stages of the company. Obviously, like Upflow is a much smaller company than Carta, and it has its own challenges at different levels. I really agree with Charly, what Charly just said around the idea that like you need to bring transparency in the grids and being clear on the fact that like you want this to be applied. I think a lot of things. One of the mistakes that we did probably at the beginning of Upflow was just kind of thinking like, well, this is going to happen because we're just nice and we want this to be like equal, and there's no reason why it wouldn't be. And you just let it happen, and you realize that after the fact that no, this is not going in that direction for the reasons that Charly just highlighted, and the many others, right? As your company is growing and as your actually team members are actually like living on their people journey, sometimes when they have kids, for example, it creates some differences. And I think the one piece of advice that I would give to other would be to be clear on your intentions on this, right? If you let things happen, it's gonna create that gap. It's a kind of natural movement. So you need to be clear with your organization on like, we don't want this to happen, and here are the steps that we're gonna take to not let it happen. So that could be like clarity in the grids typically. That could be like how you think about parenthood as well. Like how do you manage this? How do you create a safe space for people to actually like take like a parental leave, whether as a woman or a man, and actually like coming back, or how you do this? That's the kind of things when, as early as possible in the journey of the company, you need to take those into account. One thing that I would add is that it's never too early to start. And I think one of the big mistakes that I sometimes see or actually like kind of happen is just the fact to say like, oh, we'll deal with that later when we're a large organization, right? And that's very common, when you start, like it's just two co-founders and maybe you have a little team of like 2-3 people around you, and well, parental leave, is that really an issue? Same, that's like the kind of things like with operating principles and stuff, like you're just like, well, we'll do this later, right? When we Facebook. Well, that's not the right thing to do. You need to be clear from the beginning. And one thing that I also highly encourage people to do, especially founders, is to lead by example on those, right? I had a kid myself last year, and it was very important for me, not only for me personally to take my parental leave, but also because this is a very important message that I'm sending to our team, that this is how we want to do things here at Upflow, right? So it was hard for me to not read like emails and stuff, but I was like, kind of like, yes, I am taking my parental leave because I know that if I'm not doing it, probably like other parents in the future will not be doing it. And I think this leading by example is also very important in this direction that we discussed earlier about being clear on your intentions, that you don't want this to happen, this gap.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think you've both mentioned something that's very important that we also see in the data, that often this gap is already created at a very early stage of careers and then tends to persist throughout the careers and even opens up further. You're right, Alex. So that's something I think, and awareness you've mentioned is a big point. And you've mentioned, Alex, that one way to do this is to be a positive role model there. Are there any other factors that you see how you can impact awareness in your business at a very early stage for these kinds of topics?
I mean, I think like in this new world, like there's much more scrutiny from the outside on your organization as well. This is something that is kind of new as well. You know, in the past, like when you would join a company, it would pretty much be a black box of like, I do like 5 interviews and then, well, I figure out like how it is when you join, right? I think that now best-in-class organizations tend to be like as transparent as possible on, as you said, Charly, around like, for example, compensation grids, like how is that going to be? But it's not only this, right? It's also about like when you go on the career page of like most companies, you actually describe in a very precise way, like how you are expecting to go through the entire people journey, right? And we kind of tend to think at Upflow that the people journey does not even stop when you leave the company. It actually stops. It never stops, right? And so you really want to think of this as like, how can you be, again, clear on what are the expectations? Also with maybe the fact that like some people may not feel comfortable with some of the things, you know, I don't know, maybe some people are do not want to work with people that will take like a 4-month like parental leave. Like, I don't know, like maybe that's the thing. That's not how we operate, and we want to be clear on this. But I think, you know, this idea that like working on a career page that is public is also like a good way to not only think about like what are our guiding principles, but also how you can make them even clearer for people that will join in the future, and trying to correct that as soon as possible, as you said earlier, Ben, like, you know, rather than trying to course correct after that, which is really, really hard to make.
Completely agree with that, Alex. The other thing we've observed over time as well, and it's not super easy to do early, but it's something to think about, is also during recruiting, be thoughtful about the panel of people you put together to decide what is the level of that person, which will guide compensation. And oftentimes you also see biases creep in at that stage, and that in itself can mean like, oh, is this person a manager or a senior manager? And just these little differences early on can start to make a difference. And we're bigger now, so it's a little easier for us to say, hey, let's be thoughtful about who is interviewing this person. It needs to be a diverse enough panel so we get all the different perspectives, and it's not just one type of personality or one type of people from a function. We also do it cross-function on purpose to get hopefully a better read on like, we all agree this is kind of the right level compared to what we expect at Carta. Because that's another thing we've seen where depending on the decisions you make early on can also have these implications on what it means in differences, even though the talent's effectively the same.
I'll just come back on one thing that's Ben, that I just thought about, is also like this this idea that like it's coming back to this idea of clarity, but like leaving no space for doubt. It's very, very important. There's a story that I like to share because I think it was like kind of like really enlightening for me to look at this. And it was like someone who actually had a child out of Upflow and actually decided that he wouldn't want to take the parental leave that we were offering, right? And at the end of the day, you know, like we were in a situation where we say, well, we're not going to force people to actually go on parental leave, right? Which is kind of like, fine, you know, so far, like no problem. And then 6 months later, I was discussing with like one of the women of the team, like she didn't have a baby or stuff, but she told me like, well, I know that he didn't take the parental leave because he has too much work, right? He couldn't take it because he had too much work, when this was not at all the case. It was just that it was his personal decision to not take it. And we actually had a lot of discussion with him around, you should take it. Are you sure? Like, this is not because you think that like the organization cannot support you. But I think what is interesting here is that in this world today, even though we would like things to be perfect and equal, you cannot assume that the society we live in is a society where people would think as in a totally neutral way, right? And so if you start thinking like this, you know that you have to go the extra mile to actually clarify again and again and again those topics. And, you know, for me, it's the same thing as like, what are your operating principles or value for your company? You need to make them extremely explicit. And that's like really like, I know I've said that already a couple of times, but I think that's one of the key things around making sure like you're going in the right direction.
Yeah, that's super interesting how it's really a continuous effort as you describe it. And it's always easy for these things to kind of creep in at a later stage if you don't pay attention. And I'm sure we could talk about just the gender pay gap. I think we could fill a whole session with that. But the idea for today is to look at several pay trends. And so another one that we kind of identified in our own data when we looked at the CFO Connect Salary Benchmark was just a huge difference between countries. Partially not surprising. We know that US salaries are much higher, but if we look at the data, actually, we can see that salaries in the US are double compared, for instance, to those in France. And even Germany and UK that usually pay better than France are still far from US salaries. So I guess my question to both of you, having both the European and the US perspective, is can Europe compete with the US for finance talent, especially considering that we're more and more working remotely and that you can pretty much work from anywhere for any company? Do you see that as an issue?
Is that we're a little more recent to seeing these trends? We're definitely seeing differences. I think personally, I don't think it's necessarily a challenge because we still see most companies looking at what is the local cost of labor, not necessarily cost of living, but cost of labor. What is the market for the talent in each respective market? It's the same thing in the US. When you look at the US data, it's very different if you talk about San Francisco, you talk about Chicago, you talk about Chattanooga, Tennessee. It's all of this has similar differences. And I think that's frankly the most complicated right now, just to understand very quickly what is the fair number for somebody who works out of London, works out of Paris, works out of Brussels. And I think just getting better data and transparency around this, to Alex's point earlier, and getting better data for all of us to be able to make these decisions, so we're able to make fair offer to employees. Do I think over time it will start to converge? Probably. We're seeing this in the US today. A lot of markets are, San Francisco is the top of the market where I have the chance to live and have a bunch of our teams, so very aware of the pay trends here. But you see certain markets that have very, very good tech talent, for example, start to creep up on San Francisco. Seattle, for example, has moved pretty significantly compared to San Francisco. New York is very close, if not above. And so to me, it's more, I think it's still possible to compete across. It's just having the right data to be able to have fair pay for the market you're in.
Yeah, I would second that in terms of like making sure to like you understand what's happening. And I think one of the challenges we have today is that it's moving really fast, right? In the past, you used to do that from time to time and just like kind of review like on a yearly basis. And what we've seen, especially with inflation like going through the roof, is just that it's really moving fast, and you need to make sure that you're correcting quickly if needed, right? But to do that, you, as Charly mentioned, you need to know what's going on. Looking just at a bigger picture on that, and you say like, do you think that like despite like potential different salaries and package, like you can still hire talent? I think we should not forget as like hiring teams and as companies that hiring is not only about like the salary, right? And I think that's another thing that is super important and that's the kind of approach we have at Upflow, is looking at like of course, like local pay trends, as we said with and I agree with Charly on this, like we're definitely not an institution where we say, well, that's the salary for an engineer and it's going to be the same salary wherever you are in the world. We take into consideration these local aspects. But one thing that is super important is just like looking at the global package that you provide to a future team member, right? And of course, salary is one of them, but it's definitely not the only one. And I think you should work pretty hard on the other thing, because at the end of the day, it's really easy to kind of like change the salary and coming and saying like, well, I can offer you 20% bump on your salary. It's much harder to provide like what goes like all across that. So equity is of course one of them, already kind of a little bit harder to actually give on a short notice. But if you think about like, the operating principles of your company, the benefits, I don't know, even the offices, for example, at Upflow, even though like we're a hybrid organization, we work pretty hard so that we have offices where people are actually very happy to come and meet together and actually work together. And each of them is not super important, but the combination of all of them, if you think about like what Basecamp like to describe as like your company as a product, if you think as what is the product that your employees are using, right? It has to be a good product. And I really like this idea. And we work really hard with our people and talent team so that Upflow as a company is a good product. And I really encourage like people around to not only think about the salary, but the entire thing of the product, which is not only the price of the product in some ways, if I just go down this analogy.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's absolutely right. The other thing that's interesting, as we observed over a few years, we also see different retention trends. If you have employees who are more just compensation centric versus, to your point, Alex, are really coming to the company for the broader set of benefits and experience and careers that they can build with the company. And I couldn't agree more. I think we're seeing a lot of our customers, we're doing it ourselves, trying to be a lot more explicit about the benefits that we have. As a CFO, it bothers me when I talk to an employee who's like, oh, I didn't know we had this benefit. And I know how much we're investing in these benefits for reasons that we all feel really good about, where we want to support, to Alex's point earlier, person and their own journey and making sure we're there at different spots in their life. But we're not always doing a great job communicating it. So it's also an ongoing effort, even for people who are at the company, to say, by the way, here's what you do. One example that we do, we reimburse for any books. Like people buy books, we pay for them. We still have probably half of our employees who don't know we do this. Even though it's actually, a benefit that attracts a lot of employees are like, oh, and in the grand scheme of things, it's actually affordable. And we want people to read. So but the communication aspect on top of it constantly is just as important. And to Alex's point, it's much more than just the cash compensation.
And I'm gonna make a little advertisement for Carta in this context, but not because I want to be nice with you, but just because that's the reason why we also use Carta at Upflow and that's something that is a very different trend between Europe and the US, is that I found out that like in Europe, there's a very shallow understanding of like the value of the equity that you're being granted. So first of all, this is not as usual as in the US. So typically we give equity to everyone at Upflow, but very few people understand like what they're being granted and the value that it has, right? And this is another thing, right? Because sometimes people will just come to you and say, well, I get an offer for, X, and it's like more than what we pay them. Well, you've been with us for 2-3 years. You were part of the early employees. You have some stocks. And they're just like, yeah, but, I kind of dismiss this. And it's just like, no, you shouldn't, right? And it's our job. We can't just say like, oh, they don't get it. It's our job as a company, as Charly said, to explain the value of the ability to buy free books or the ability to just exercise equity and what does it mean, right? And it's an important part of like our job as a company to make that a comprehensive set of like value proposition for the team members, but also explaining like what all of those different things actually like how they work, what's their value, how they're going to evolve in the future, and it's a hard job, honestly, but I think that makes it like much more interesting and more rich than, talking about like a 20% bump on your salary.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting to be reminded that fixed salary is not everything. And especially in startups, there are a few other things to it that can make you competitive or not. I'd be interested, Charly, because you mentioned that you obviously rely a lot on data, especially if it comes to finding out what's a decent, what's a fair salary in certain locations. How do you do that? Which data do you rely on? Where do you get them?
We use our own. We created a benchmarking product that does this. We serve at this point, we're lucky enough to serve 30,000 customers in the private space, many early stage, but also all the way to our size. And so we've got a pretty decent set of data around it. And we're just, we realized there was a real pain point for a lot of our customers, and many of our customers work in the finance or legal functions. And Just how do we make it easier, especially around equity? So cash generally was okay information, surveys, and a variety of data points that at least give you enough to move in an okay direction. I think the last few years made that even more difficult because it's really difficult to get surveys out all the time. So we were thinking about how can we use the information we have real time, but equity was always a real challenge. How do you know what you issue at Series A, at Series B, at Series C? What is market? And that changes all the time for different roles as well. So we really rely on our own data, and frankly, and continue to also test that versus our offer accept and everything we see on the recruiting front. So it's kind of also getting real-time market feedback to make sure we're in the right spot.
Okay, that's interesting. And you're obviously lucky in this position to have all these data. We have a question from the audience, actually, and it's related to what you said earlier. That's not only about fixed salary, but there are a lot of perks. And one of them is so-called workations, which is tending to be more of the part of the package that companies offer. So question from the audience is, how do you actually implement this both from a legal perspective, as you're dealing with several locations, and how do you make sure that there's a clear policy around this?
Say more what you mean by workation. What do you
workation, mostly connected to remote work. So you're being able to work from, let's say, I can just speak from a European perspective. It's very common to travel to the Canary Islands during winter. I've done that myself, quite nice, and work from there actually. Is that something you offer to employees? And if so, what are the rules around this?
Yeah, so the only thing we do, generally so we have a portion of our employee that's fully remote, but for the most part, we're an office company, also hybrid on two days a week. But what we do for the whole company is everybody can work from wherever they want in July. But it's limited. Part of the reason it's somewhat manageable is just 1 month, and that's the month where people can effectively be fully remote during 1 month. That's what we're doing. Frankly, we're still very much in testing mode. We're trying a few things to see what works best for our company, especially now that we're expanding internationally. I'm sure we'll continue to test this differently. But we did last July, and the reception was really good.
That's a good. It's a good idea about like 1 month that is like more open to it. On our side, we're obviously like a much smaller company, so I think one of the challenges is that what works when you're a team of 10, 13, or maybe 50 may not work when you're a team of 200. I'm, as founders, just with my co-founder, we're extremely careful on like what actually works today and what could not work in the future. And we're very clear with the team that anything we say or anything we try to implement is not granted and should not be taken for granted. We went out of, as anyone else, like as any other company, we went out of the pandemics with, having worked like fully remote for a long time, all of us. We tried to take a soft approach to this, and I think what is really annoying for people is when there's a strict rules that is being enforced, but no one really understands why we're doing this. We tend to have like the same thing that you have, Charly. Like we have fully remote people and then like hybrid type of position. Again, very clear upon hiring and onboarding, which track are you in, right? Same as IC and manager, like, you're trying to say, well, it's different tracks, it's different rules. We take it differently. And as managers, we also encourage them to think really hard before they open a position. How do you want to open that position, right? Typically, we found, just to give you an example, we found out that like it was really hard for BDR, so our sales representative that need to prospect and do like a lot of cold calling and stuff, to be fully remote, right? And the reality is that like I would love to be proven wrong, but the reality is just like when you need to make like, a lot of calls, a lot of like, things, it's better to be at some point, and we don't say 5 days a week, but it's better to be sitting next to each other and actually do it together, right? That's what we found out, right? The reality is just that we tried it and it didn't work, and so we kind of backtracked on that. And so I think you want to remain flexible, but you want to be clear with the team that like what are the objectives behind it. And I think like overall, one of our operating principles at Upflow is around radical ownership. This is a very strong aspect of like, I don't really care if you're working from the Canary Island or wherever you are, because one one of the way we work is that we're going to give you ownership on your work. And I think we need to think about this rather than thinking about like what are the legal implementation stuff. Like this should come second, and always as a second step, not as a first constraint, and then you build your policy around that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we do, though, have another question from the audience regarding the legal part of it. That seems to be an interest in there. How do you deal with the local tax requirements when it comes to workation, but also to full remote work in various destinations?
For us, that's why we limit it to 1 month, because the moment you get past 1 month, that's where it gets complicated. And so, frankly, we're also testing what we'll see if it works. And that's also why we have very clear distinction of like who's attached to an office, who's remote. Because I mean, in the United States, you do have to file in every state, and there's a lot of complexity in actually having. That's what a lot of people don't appreciate. If you come to the US, actually going to each state is its own thing in terms of hiring employees in each state. It's actually more complicated than people think to have a broad remote workforce, even in the United States, because the requirements are different depending on where you are. So just, I would encourage everyone to be very thoughtful about this, because it can get complicated fast. And can have interesting implications on your financials in terms of filing sales taxes and these types of things, depending on if you have people in the state. And so there's a lot of complexity around it. So we basically go through a review process of, are we okay to get somebody in this new state if we're not there yet, and then limit, as I mentioned, and kind of workation type of topic to 1 month.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, Charlie, that you're mentioning here, because we had this kind of interesting wake-up call after COVID, when I remember like some of our team members just sending us like FYI email about like, oh, like I'm actually now living in another country. Yes. It's just like, well, guess what? Your current contract says that you were working in an office from New York or Paris, and it's not that easy, right? And I think, there was all this kind of like moment where it was a little bit like, uncertain, and we again needed to provide clarity on this and explaining that like it's not that flexible. On our side, Ben, just to share like from a legal perspective how we organize. So we have two companies. So we have Upflow Inc. in the US and Upflow in France, and it's organized around what we call the hubs. So the offices, where we have one in New York, one in Paris, and these are the two biggest hubs. And we call it hubs because typically, if you are working remote from like EMEA, and we have like people like working full remote like across like the EMEA region, with a set of rules typically on time zones, so that like we can actually work together in an efficient way, especially taking into account the US and Europe. If you're coming to an office, it has to be in a hub, right? One thing that was very clear for us and intentional as well is just that, well, if you guys live together, like just 2 hours drive from each other, if you have to work, it's not like somewhere in the middle, it's in one of our offices, because we want our offices or the hubs to be those places where it's actually happening, right? And this is something that we think a lot is quite important in the culture. And I see that this is another question around how you build a cohesive culture despite like being remote. Now, if you're full remote, one thing that is super important to understand is that from a legal perspective, and we're not going to need to go into the details, but it's very complex. It's very complex in the US to go into different states, but it's also very complex to hire people from the outside. And I think like a lot of people thought at the beginning, well, we can just make a French contract if you're working for somewhere else. And it's not the case at all. You can have a lot of problems, and you need to fix that as soon as possible. I would highly encourage people to use like an employer of record, such as Deal or Omnipresent. There's a couple of them now that actually provide you with a local structure. It's really easy. It's really streamlined. Or actually, that's much more easier than setting up yourself. But it should not be underestimated, because it is much more complex from a legal tax perspective than what people think. And you can get into a lot of trouble as a company if you don't comply with us.
Yeah, and you've touched on a really important topic there. That's actually also a question from our audience about culture. So how do you build this common culture when people are working from anywhere and everywhere? I'm sure that's something that you, Alex, as a founder, and also you, Charly, as a CFO, have been a challenge that you've been faced with. How do you tackle this issue in your respective organizations?
I can give you my like what we're doing as a small company growing and stuff. But first, it's not working from anywhere at any time. We need to have some rules about like where do we accept people to work from. Typically for us, it's like no more than 2 hours west from New York and 2 hours east from Paris, just because, I mean, Vegas today, it's like 8 a.m., but it's already, France is already probably like, it's already the end of the day. If you want to have like a little bit of airtime and work together, like you need to actually like be clear on this and where do you want to work. And I think beyond that, you're coming back to this idea of like values or peer team principles that you really want to clarify again as a team, especially when it started growing, to make sure that whether you're working like in an office, whether you're working like full remote, you understand them, you actually like work along those principles. And I think this is something that has been very, very important as we passed like from 10 to 50, like clarifying this and making sure that like it's something that is used as a tool to like hire and operate as a team. The second thing I would say is that these offices for us are a key, like the hubs that I mentioned earlier, are a key part of our culture. And we try to make a lot of things so that those hubs are really living. Typically, we've implemented an exchange program at Upflow. So typically, we started seeing like a kind of a silo of like things between the US and Europe, whether people were remote or not. And one thing that we implemented was an exchange program whereby after 9 months at Upflow, you have the opportunity to go and work from the other hub. So if you're attached to the EMEA hub, you will go to the New York hub for a month, and we fully pay that. That's typically some of the benefits that are not included into like the salary or stuff, but makes a lot of difference for new joiner employees and is a very, very strong component of our culture. So that's typically the kind of things that you can think about to kind of solidify your culture as the company is growing and like going remote. So that's it. That was an example on our side.
I'll reemphasize what Alex says around operating principles. That's pretty critical to be clear as to what you expect of people, how you want people to behave, and that's pretty critical again, from recruiting to onward. One of the things we've done forever that's helped a lot in terms of building a culture is we have 2 meetings a week where the whole company gets on Zoom together, and we're 2,000 people today. We still do it. One is something we call show and tell, which is when people talk about what they're working on. And so it can be my team, the finance team, the engineering team, the product team, anything, new things that are happening in the company as a way for everybody to feel connected to the new things happening across the company. That's been really helpful, and generally we get a lot of engagement. And then every Friday, our CEO does a town hall. Effectively, either we'll cover specific topics or Q&A with the employee base. And those are always opportunities to kind of reinforce, like, here's why we do what we do. And to Alex's point, sometimes why is this process in place? Why do we make these decisions? And really forcing us to be able to explain and be very transparent as to why the decision was what it was. And that is, and what it's important is for us, it brings it back, like, because we believe in these operational tenets, this is why we got to this decision. And that really trains everybody as to how do we want to think about things, how do we think about solving problems at a company like ours. So that has been very helpful. Interestingly, we were an in-office company fully before the pandemic, but we already had offices across the US. And so we already were all on Zoom before. So we just were able to kind of do this even as we switched to all remote for a little bit. And now we have a smaller part of the company remote, but we're trying to be thoughtful also about bringing them to offices. We have enough representation in a few large locations that it's easy to bring people together. So we do more offsites and things where, at this size, where you do want to bring people together on a regular basis to make sure that there's that connection. Because it was very clear during the pandemic that the connectivity people felt was very different for people who just joined us remote and had never met their teams versus the ones who had been together working in an office. And that's why we still feel like getting people together is important for the long term.
Yeah. I think it's something that keeps on coming back, Ben, and that I think we can share with the audience.
I think we've lost Alex there for a second.
Oops, am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Sorry.
Sorry about that. I was just saying that there's no silver bullet, and it's it's something that keeps on coming back from all of the questions we have. I think that's one of the beauty, but also like one of the difficulties of like building a company or building an organization. It's just the fact that like you can take every single failure and say, well, that was a failure. But if you want to look at success, it's actually oftentimes the result of a lot of different things. And you need to think carefully and on the long run about like how you wanna do this.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Spendesk actually is just coming back from our first offsite in 2 years with the whole company in southern France last week, and so this element of connecting and actual exchange is definitely important. Before moving on to the next topic, there's just one more question. I think it's going back, Alex, to what you said about equity and the importance of it as a benefit. Someone from the audience is asking, can European startups be competitive in global recruitment with their long-term financial incentive plans? It seems there is not an off-the-shelf legal standard tool for these startups, as each country has its own tools.
Yes, that's one of the main issue we had. I think like if you look at 5 years ago, like it was like VCs would not even invest in a company outside of the US. I think that it changed a bit, but now the problem is becoming at an employee level where typically I know that, for example, if you have a German company, like the local laws, and especially if you are hired like from anywhere in the world, makes it extremely complex to make it something standard and something that people can understand and that is valued as well. I'm not sure if this is the best option, but what we've done we went through Y Combinator, and so we had to incorporate a company in the US. But from what I feel today, wherever you are in the world, like having equity in a US company still remains like, if it's not the norm, it's at least like the standard thing. And I would actually encourage like anyone starting a company, if you think that at some point you're going to have international operations, to actually like incorporate in the US for that reason. I think like there's a lot of things around, like people think that it's only for tax evasion and stuff, which is definitely not the case. It really depends on like how you structure things. And I'm sure Charly can tell that like it's not because you're in the US that you're going to pay less taxes. But I think like that would be my my high level advice if you can do it. But I know that it's not always easy, right? And you only even think about this when you are at the very beginning of the company. So it's not an easy one.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think equity is definitely something, obviously, we think a lot about, but to me is the best form of incentive and that drives the best kind of alignment across everybody and sense of ownership. And so finding a way to be able to deploy equity to employees. In our case, every single person gets equity. I know that's not always the case. Like, so certain companies choose to pick the roles that do, but we feel pretty strongly that that's the trend it's going in, and we want to be the type of company where every single person has a piece of the ownership. And so just finding ways to do that, I think, is the best way to be competitive.
Okay, cool, super clear. Let's move on to one more topic that's kind of hot right now in the pay space and when it comes to employee benefits. The 4-day working week. It's something that a lot of companies started introducing, that a lot of employees are asking for, as we've seen in our survey as well. However, the majority of companies still, for instance, in France, Germany, UK, so in Europe mostly, it's less than 20% actually of companies that start doing it. How do you feel about this? Is there certainly pros and cons to it? Have you been considering it at your company? And if yes, or if no, why not? Why yes?
Yeah, happy to talk about what we do. So certainly we were trying to be as mindful as we could, especially during the pandemic, where we're really trying to be mindful about burnout and there was no separation between personal life and work life. And one of the things we started to do, so we're a 5-day work week, but we've implemented, so we have unlimited time off, but we've also implemented something that's minimum time off. So everybody at the company has to take at least 15 days off. I know for a lot of, I'm a European, I know August in France used to be, but in the US, people like 2 weeks is what a lot of people take, and so you almost have to like really force people to take it. And so that's why that's one way we're trying to ensure that our employees take enough time off, and really instead of just like one day here and there, just like take a full week off, actually really completely unplug. To Alex's point earlier, like make sure people take their parental leaves, and all these things are really important for the right balance. So that's been our approach to kind of be mindful about how do we think about the workload and kind of the stress employees may be under, and making sure that they get at least a few weeks off per year. And that's so far has worked. But it does put more pressure on managers. I think it's something to be acknowledged. Like we track this and make sure that, you know, when I see somebody who's like hasn't taken time off in a long time, I'll go talk to them and say, hey, when's the next vacation plan? But I think it's healthy too, because it forces managers to actually pay attention to what's happening with their teams.
Yeah, I think it's I totally stick on that, and it's interesting that the answer to the 4 days a week is actually like something around holidays and time off, because I think same as you know, when a customer is asking for a feature, like here it's your team asking for a feature, the good product managers will try to understand like what's behind the feature. I think that's the approach we have, right? What's the question behind like this 4-day week, right? And again, like I mean, we haven't implemented it. We are on a 5 days a week, but we're thinking pretty hard on like what are we trying to achieve here? And I think what we're trying to achieve here is a good work-life balance. And for me, this idea that like you want people to be able to disconnect, to take some time off. We're also thinking on like how can you really take a break, like even outside of parental leave, like, you know, parental leave is yes, a big break from the company, but we're trying to think now on like, is that the only occasion where you should take a big break in your career, right? Maybe sometimes like you're not having any kid or you don't want to have any kids, and that's fine. And maybe you also deserve like you can have a break from the company at some point. So because ultimately, even though like short term, this is going to be like a potential loss of productivity for the company, long term, this is definitely a gain. These are the kind of things that you should think about. So if some companies like find it useful to implement it as a 4 days week, that's totally fine. For us, and it probably comes back to this idea of ownership, I don't see we don't see the value yet, but I think it's a very, very healthy habit to force managers to actually review if people are actually taking time off. And when they're taking time off, are they really taking time off, or are they connected all the time? What's the best factor? Like what's happening when someone is not in the office? And I think it's healthy that you start thinking around this. So that would be my read, and that's our read on this so far at Upflow.
Okay, super interesting. Being mindful of time, we only have 2 minutes left, but we have one more question that actually I wanted to ask you, and that's also been popping up in our Q&A tab, which is about inflation and that connected to the economic context. And more generally, the current economic context, which we all know is not great, and specifically the fact that there's high inflation, is something you consider when you talk about pay in your companies, and how do you feel this topic will impact your company and your employees over the next couple of months?
Yeah, for us, it's certainly consider it, but we didn't go. So we give our cash adjustments in the middle of the year. So we just did this in July. But so to the discussion we had earlier, Ben, we went back to the data and see like what is the market saying, right? And there's been movement. Interesting on the finance side, not a lot of movement in finance pay. We've seen more movement in kind of data teams, engineering, sales. So there's been a few pockets of movement over the last 6 months that we took into account. And it does come back to us, like we want to be competitive with the market. I mean, inflation will impact this, but we're not just going and giving everybody a 9% raise, for example. And then we certainly also don't give the same raise to everyone, right? It's based on your performance, and that's something we've evolved through a lot of trial and error, to be perfectly clear on like how do you match performance. And now we have something that's worked for a few years, where we have very clear grading for every employee, and that kind of will have an impact on cash compensation. And so, and again, very clearly communicated, what does it mean to be rated X, Y, or Z, and how you can evolve. And then we're pretty focused on making sure our top performers get kind of the higher the higher increases, while again, making it work. To your point, it's an uncertain environment, so still making it work financially for the company, in a budget that we all agreed was reasonable, but also understanding that our main investment is our employees, so making sure that continues to be the case.
Yeah, I would definitely second that, and saying that maybe one piece of advice here would just be do not panic when that happens. I think there's, we all read the big newspaper and saying like, oh, inflation is going through the roof and stuff. And I think it's a little bit like same as like when a team member is going to you and say, I want this pay increase, or I'm just going to leave. And sometimes when you're starting to have this conversation, it's already too late, right? And I think like we need you to be careful, listening to the market, having the right data points. There's a lot of ways of having data points. One of the simplest one would be to actually listen to your team members when they actually interview or get offers from others, and just making sure that like you understand where you are in the market. If you can afford it, or if you're using the right tools, you can also like look at like what's happening on the market. But I think it's very important that like, and the more comprehensive your package is, the more time you have as well. Just understanding that like you're not going to jump on like a 9% increase for everyone just because there was an inflation this month. So I would definitely second Charly in this, and in this kind of step, like thinking about this before kind of jumping on the increase for everyone.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I'd like to thank you both very much for joining us today, Alex and Charly. It's been super interesting to discuss pay trends with you. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today for the CFO Connect Summit, and specifically for this panel. As mentioned, it's the last one. However, we're not quite done yet. So please head over to our closing session at 6 p.m. with my colleagues from the CFO Connect team. And I hope I'll see you there. Thanks
for having us, Ben.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us. Bye.